Welcome back, history students. Today we're going to start looking at the rise of cities. I'm going to start describing the difference between a private city and a public city. All cities at one point began as private cities. A private city is a city where all the modern advancements are financed by private investors. That's a private city. So there are good and bad things about private cities. The good thing is that private investors help the city develop in some ways. There are improvements in the cities, like new buildings that are built or better transportation. But the bad thing about it is that private investors only are going to invest money in projects that make them a profit. They're not going to invest in things like sewage systems, clean water systems, garbage pickup, police departments, parks, because none of those things make money. So in a private city, you do see improvements in buildings and transportation. If you build a building, you can charge people rent, and that becomes an investment, right? And then eventually you get your money back. If you invest in transportation, you can charge people to use your trolley car, and eventually you get your money back. That's where we see the advancements in private cities. But again, only to a point. Now, by the 1900s, most American cities had started to switch from private cities to becoming public cities. A public city is a city that has an active city government, and we start to see government improving the cities. So it's when cities become public cities that we start to see sanitation programs, parks being built, police departments, fire departments being organized, clean water efforts, sewage systems. Those services don't turn a profit, but they do make the cities a better place to live and a nicer place to live. So that's how most cities develop. They start as private cities where all the development's paid for by private investors, but eventually the city governments and the state governments in some cases get involved, and the cities start to be cleaned up and improve. All right, before I get to transportation, I want to talk a little bit about the development of American cities. Most American cities started out as small communities. Even New York City at one point was a small community. As city populations grew, people began to move away from the center of the city and move into what we call the suburbs. I made a little circle here. Usually I write on the board. Imagine this little circle is a city, right? Most cities begin very small. So when cities are small like this, the city center really is the whole city, right? It is the place where people live and the place where people work. So all cities begin pretty small. But as populations rise, people begin to move away from the city centers. And imagine a larger circle around the city that we would call the suburbs. Now, who moved away from the city center as the population grew? The wealthier people were able to move further away from the city center because they could afford transportation, which I'm going to mention in a minute. So the city centers in a lot of cities became known as the business districts. So the city centers became known as the business district, and a lot of cities have their business and industries in the center. And again, I'm talking in generalities at this point because not every city is exactly the same, but this is generally how many cities developed. So wealthy residents who can afford transportation move away from the city centers, and they might commute to work during the day if they have their business here, but at night they would travel further away from the city to the suburbs to live. So who ends up living in the city centers then, in what we call the business districts? The poorest residents who can't afford transportation. So in many cities, the city centers or the business districts become overcrowded with poor housing. And the poorest residents have to live in the city center because that's where the jobs are. And they have to live within walking distance of the jobs because they can't afford transportation. And we start to use this term, the inner city, in America, which we use to describe the poorest area of a city. Where did that term come from? You might wonder, why do we call the poor neighborhoods the inner city, right? Well, why? Well, because in many cities, the poorest neighborhoods were in the middle of the cities, the city centers. So that became known as the inner city, and that typically is where the poorest residents were. So that's where that term inner city comes from, and people still use that term today to describe the poorest neighborhoods in a city. Although I will point out that that's not exactly an accurate term, inner city. Not all poor neighborhoods in cities are in the inner part of the cities. You know, look at New York City, for example. Midtown Manhattan is technically the inner city, yet that isn't considered a poor area of New York City. And there are poorer boroughs and areas of New York City that aren't necessarily in the middle of New York City. So it's really an inaccurate term that we use to describe cities, but it's stuck, and that's where that term inner city comes from. So that's how cities developed, is they began with a business district, a city center, and eventually as transportation improved, the wealthiest people moved further and further away, and we end up with the poorest people living where the industry is, where the jobs are, because they can't afford to commute. And again, the term inner city, not exactly accurate to describe the poorest neighborhoods of cities. So let's look at developments in transportation and talk about how transportation began to improve. And we'll talk about other innovations in the American cities also. So in the 1800s and into the early 1900s, we start to see transportation improve in American cities. So I'm going to give you an example of 3 types of public transportation that we see develop in American cities. And I'm going to start with something called the omnibus. This is a photograph of an omnibus. Pretty much what it is a horse and carriage. This was the first public transportation in American cities, was a horse-drawn carriage. And it's a pretty large carriage if you look at that picture. So an omnibus goes about 6 miles an hour because it's pulled by horses, and it has very limited capacity. If you look at this omnibus, maybe 10 people can fit on it, maybe a few more, but it's not going to fit many people. And it is expensive for average Americans. So it would have cost a lot of money to take an omnibus, and the poorest people couldn't afford to take an omnibus. So not really the most efficient way of transportation. The omnibus was eventually replaced by what's called the cable car. And this is a photograph of a cable car in Chicago. A cable car started to replace the omnibuses after the 1870s. And it was pulled by an underground cable. And it was powered by a steam engine. So a cable car went a little bit faster than the omnibus, and you could fit more people in the cable car, that you could have several cars. So it was more efficient than the omnibus, but it was not reliable. The steam engines that pulled the underground cables would constantly break down, and so you never knew when the cable cars were going to break down. Eventually, cable cars were replaced with the electric trolley. This is a photograph of the electric trolley in Boston, Massachusetts. The electric trolley replaced the cable cars in the late 1880s. And these were much more efficient than the cable cars. They were much cheaper to run than the steam engines, because the steam engines ran on coal. They could go 10 to 12 miles per hour. You could have many cable cars going at once and transport many people. And trolley cars really became more and more popular in American cities as we get into the 1900s. In some cities, the electric trolleys were placed underground to make more room on the streets for people and horses. And in New York City, we have the subway system. What's the subway system? It's the underground electric trolley. That's where we put the electric trolley in New York City. So as transportation became cheaper and more efficient, more and more people left the city centers and moved further and further away from the cities. So that allowed the cities to grow in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Another innovation in American cities by the mid-1800s was building skyscrapers that were taller and taller. I know that this is a controversial topic of who built the first skyscraper in the United States, but historians pretty much agree that the first skyscraper was built in the city of Chicago with a steel and iron skeleton. This is a building, this is an image of the building called the Home Insurance Building. It was built in 1885 in the city of Chicago. It was 10 stories tall at first, and it is considered by historians to be the first skyscraper in the United States. So Chicago has the claim to fame of having the first skyscraper. Now you might wonder, can I go to this building now? No. This building was demolished in the 1930s. So there isn't, this building the way it was does no longer exist. No longer exists in Chicago. By 1900, there started to be a competition among cities to see who could build the biggest skyscraper. And the invention that really helped the skyscraper get taller and taller was the invention of the elevator. There was a man from upstate New York named Elijah Otis. And he's very important in the beginning of the skyscrapers, in the beginning of the development of the skyscrapers, because he invented the first elevator with automatic safety device to stop it from falling if the chain broke. And the Otis elevator allowed skyscrapers to be built taller and taller and taller and give people a safe way to get to the upper floors. You know, a skyscraper is great, but if you have to walk up 10 stories, it's not that great. So the Otis elevator allowed buildings to get taller and taller and taller and allowed people quick ways to get to the upper floors. And so it's because of the use of iron and steel skeletons and the Otis elevator that we see skyscrapers getting taller and taller and taller by the early 1900s. Right, before I move on, I want to talk a little bit about life in the American cities, briefly. In the late 1800s, in the early 1900s, life in American cities was difficult. We look at cities today and we look at all of the innovations that cities have that make life enjoyable in the cities that didn't exist back then. You know, if you went back in time to an American city in the late 1800s, it was dirty. There wasn't great sewage pickup. There was a lot of poverty. What people would do in terms of sanitation is they would dump trash into the alleys between the buildings. And a lot of buildings did not have plumbing. So people would dump buckets of waste out their windows also into the alley. We didn't, and that ended up ruining the clean water systems. If you're dumping sewage into the streets and garbage in the streets, it can contaminate the water that people drink. So it was difficult to get clean water in the cities in the late 1800s. A lot of cities didn't have really great police departments or fire departments. If a fire broke out, the community would help to put the fire out. But oftentimes an entire block of buildings would burn to the ground before they could contain the fire because they didn't have fire departments. Crime was a big problem in the cities. Many people in the cities didn't go out at night because that was when crimes occurred and there wasn't an effective police department to call to help in terms of crimes. So a lot of people didn't go out at night. There were unsafe buildings that people lived in, with unsanitary conditions and overcrowded apartments. So that was an issue. So and the other thing I want to mention is, there are a lot of horses on the streets in our major cities in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. What do horses do a lot of? Poop. So the streets of all of our cities in this country were full of manure, and that would also contaminate the clean water. So cities were very smelly and dirty and dangerous, really, in the turn of the 20th century. They weren't the most pleasant places to be. Now, as we get to the 1900s, that's when we start to see effective fire departments, police departments, sanitation departments, and that's when we start to see sewage systems being built. We see better transportation, we see clean water systems, and that's when things start to improve in the cities. We start to see parks being built and green spaces, and that's when cities start to become more pleasant to live in. But cities weren't really the cleanest, safest places to be at this time period. All right, next video I will be looking at urban populations, and we also are going to do a focus on immigration that we're going to look at in the next video. So see you then.